But thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sanjay, and I think you're the logical person to start this off. I want to take a top-down view of where the regulatory process is, given your work within the policy domain as well. There are a couple of vectors when I look at the regulatory frameworks that are being thrown out there. I just looked at I think it's one of the links from your website. Bloomberg Law has a way of, if anybody wants to kind of take a closer look at it, they have a map, and you can basically click on any state and see what is the state of AI regulation. So there's some gray states, quite a few, in the middle of the country. So, but definitely on the coast, there's some action going on. And I just cherry-picked a few to see randomly like what is happening. I picked Texas, I picked some of the East Coast, and the West Coast. And it seems like the vectors were not necessarily new. It's privacy and disclosure. That if you want to make sure that the data you're handling stays outside of these so-called training models and so on and so forth. And the disclosure part, that if you are interacting with somebody or an entity, that you disclose that AI is a partner. Kind of reminded me of the GMO kind of movement a little bit. That okay, if you're eating that corn is GMO and that corn is not GMO. So if you could talk to us a little bit about the vectors. Are there more vectors? Are we enhancing these specific vectors of privacy and disclosure? Or do you see any other vectors that are either there in discussions or should emerge? I'd love to hear from you.
Again, I don't want to make this really as much about policy, because a lot of these people probably are looking at what the business aspects of it is. So first, disclosure, I'm big for innovation. I'm an entrepreneur. So we don't want to hold down innovation. So I want to make sure that these people don't start thinking just about regulation. And I'm not a politician per se. But the reality is that in Europe, there is a GDPR. Right. And in the United States, we don't have a privacy law per se. And what states have done is they've taken it upon themselves to kind of build this patchwork of laws. Now you would say, why is that this GDPR is not that relevant? Because who reads all that stuff that they ask you? You just say accept all and move on. But those things do become important, because the way AI works, and my panelists can probably tell you a lot more, is we are ingesting data that is publicly available. In some cases, your data. It could be your medical records or things of that nature. Now you would say, hey, we have HIPAA and stuff like that. I mean, do you know how old HIPAA is? I mean, we've not had changes, and you can probably talk a lot more on that. So I think, and also, Rohit, we've had a big change happen in the past 10 days in this country. So we had an executive order done by President Biden, I think it was in October 2023 or something of that nature. That's gone. And also 3 days ago or 4 days ago, there was another seminal event that happened in the world, which is DeepSeek. That has also policy and governance implications, because some people have said, Mark Andreessen said, it's a Sputnik moment. Now, what does that mean? That it's innovation all out, and we'll worry about policy and regulations a little bit later, because we don't want to be left behind. So when you talked about the vectors, I think privacy, transparency, explainability. When you get the information that all of us, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Mistral, any of those things you use, what is the foundation of how are they coming up with these answers? That's kind of like a black box that exists. So I think those are the things, Rohit, that kind of need to be addressed, because nobody can tell you how is. Now in some cases, like they have started, like Claude and others have started showing you now with some of these reasoning engines, that how is the system kind of reasoning. But in terms of data gathering and things of that nature, I'm sure hopefully we'll talk about data bias and stuff like that. So I think those are issues that obviously we should be concerned about. We obviously need to have innovation. We don't want to get left behind, but let's just make sure we don't win the race, but we lose a lot of things in the process. That's the thing that I worry about. But I'm sure my panelists can probably give you a lot better on this.
Sanjay, that's a great start to the conversation. So we have Raj here, who has been a CISO at in a wide range of industries and at companies that are the pinnacle of those industries. So I want to move the conversation to Raj, given the panorama of information security challenges you have encountered, you have written on, and so on and so forth. And then I'll come to Aastha and Poorva specifically regarding the segments that they have been effectively specializing in. So Raj, on to you. Sanjay just really laid down the situation pretty well as to you have privacy, you have disclosure, you have explainability. What are some of the challenges that you encounter or have encountered as you've seen your role evolve as you went from AI, ML to now Gen AI, which seems like a step function from where we were?
Right. I think a great point raised, right? So one thing is, with the adoption of generative AI capability is, there are two hats that people like me wear. One is the security hat, right? And the security hat is, okay, how can I use these capabilities for advanced malware detection, for auto-reactive incident response? How can I speed up my, various response processes and procedures, right? So that's where we see that, this could be very helpful. Like, for example, if you may have heard about Security Copilot, that actually could, do a lot of tier 1, tier 2 incident response work, SOC work, right? So I think that those are areas as a security professional we look at the advantages. There's also a bunch of agentic AI capabilities that Microsoft has launched, and obviously you guys have probably read about all that, right? So I think that we feel that, but as a technologist, I think what we have to do is the risk-reward kind of sort of, we have to look at it from that lens. Okay, what are the rewards that we think we can get? Productivity improvements, reactive response, speed of response, right? Because the attackers are getting more sophisticated and they also have this technology at hand, right? So we needed to counter the attackers. So that's the reward, right? But the risk is, okay, these things could be attacked. Data could be poisoned. If your training data set could be poisoned. There is the challenge that we face is oversharing of data within the organization. For example, you don't want, if you put your data in SharePoint, you put it on spreadsheets, you put it on other internal secure mechanisms, right, for example, right? But if you have Copilot loose in your environment, and it has access into your Azure ecosystem 365, it could actually read that data. You don't want to have data leaking out that actually hasn't been publicly released, right? So I think these are things is, okay, how do you actually stop the oversharing of data that you never intended in the first place to share, right? So that's a problem that we have to obviously figure out. So I think what Microsoft is trying to do is, they have tags now that, okay, you can tag your document, say, okay, this is confidential and not to be indexed by Copilot. Now, I don't know, it could be defeated potentially, right? So I think they are trying because they've figured out the problem with that, right? Is open access. I don't know in your environments, but look in corporate America, a lot of these environments are fairly open, right? And the Graph API, if you have 365 that you're running, Copilot can actually go read your blog, it can read your email, it can read SharePoint, it can read your Teams channels, it can read OneDrive. Right? And then if somebody asks it a question, and if that person has access, it can respond, and you can actually cajole an answer out of AI by going around it, right? You can ask various questions. So I think that's the risk that we face is immediate risk of data oversharing, data exfiltration, right? You don't want somebody to say, hey, what's the salary that my coworker makes? You don't want it to give that answer. What's the salary of my entire department? You don't want it to give that answer, right? So I think those are some of the basic fundamental challenges that corporate America faces, right? And then there are bigger challenges, biases. You can develop biases, we have to worry about that. There's obviously the compliance risk, right? So like, for example, HIPAA, or, and if you're operating in a classified environment, or if you have CUI data, right? So there's the commercial aspect, there is the government aspect. You don't want CUI data leaking out. CUI data should not be sitting in commercial networks anyway, but in reality it could be there, right? So I think those are some of the other things we have to worry about. There is also risks about, like, for example, prompt injection attacks, data poisoning, biases, like I mentioned earlier, right? So these are some of the things that we are worrying about as we are figuring, okay, how do we adopt this platform? How do we aid, speed up our productivity? Because the reality is that corporate America is investing a lot of money right, in these platforms, and we have to see the return of investment, right? And that's why the DeepSeek launch caused the stock market to crash, because when they're claiming that they can train these models at 10% of the cost, while the industry is spending billions of dollars investing in Microsoft and OpenAI and Google, AWS and otherwise, right? So I think those are some of the risks that we feel. But I think I wouldn't worry about the financials. We'll see. We don't know if DeepSeek is using a bunch of H100s from NVIDIA. We don't know that, right? We don't know how their infrastructure is. But the reality is that, we feel that, I personally feel that in the cybersecurity realm, there's a lot of good that can happen from this. We just have to make sure that we understand the risks, we mitigate the risks, we remediate the risks, or we transfer the risks, right? And we take the good, we manage the bad. I think that's how we have to move forward.
So thank you so much, Raj, and I think there's so much in there. In the past I've worn some DLP hats. It seems like a nightmarish scenario emerging here a little bit. I have a question that is partly for you, and I may come back to you on that, but I want to move to Aastha. Raj is giving the example of Copilot ingesting data that may not be properly classified, for example. When I say classified in the generic sense, not in the governmental sense, there's some knowledge bases that should not be mixing and matching, et cetera, et cetera. What about the challenge of what you get out of the model? So if Copilot gives you a response and there's even this much hallucination in it, and then that becomes part of your operations and decisions are made based on that, how are you handling that part? And I'll tie this to the regulatory part later on, but I just wanted to see, as you use more and more Gen AI, and I also want to transition from the ML part to the Gen AI part, what are you doing about that specifically? And then obviously I want to know, broadly speaking, what is the regulatory implication for you as being within the government?
It's a lot of questions nested into one. So, what you get out of using AI. First of all, let me just preface this. Being in the government, we are very restricted on where and how we use AI. We're doing a lot of policy exploration to figure out how do you regulate this thing, especially when it's moving at the speed of light. And any kind of oversight, any kind of regulation has to be at least one step ahead of that. Or trying to be one step, can you guys hear me better? Yeah. Trying to be one step ahead of that. So the use of AI within government is pretty tightly controlled, at least on the security side it is. I can't speak for all the agencies, I can speak for mine. Right now, we are much more focused on using AI to help our data challenges. We brought up AI/ML, and I think for us, the focus is on how do we take the vast amounts of data. The US government has a lot of data. My agency has a lot of data. And when you do cybersecurity for both the private and the public sectors, you are amassing vast quantities of data. So you have to analyze that, and there's not enough people in government to analyze that. So you have to use some kind of AI or other machine learning to help you with that. The outputs of that obviously have human supervision on them. I wanted to make that point particularly because if you're looking at ChatGPT, OpenAI, you're looking at DeepSeek, one key difference is that DeepSeek is cheaper because they have no human supervision. It's a self-reinforced learning. So the fear I have with that is, if you do have a bias, there's a possibility of amplification of that bias because there's no human supervision. So it's cheaper, okay, sure, and if you focus it tightly, that's what DeepSeek is for, DeepSeek, right? So it's meant to be used for more specialized types of usage. OpenAI is more generalized, more conversational. But you have human supervision there. And I think that is a very key difference as to why you saw the stock market take a plunge and then you saw it come right back up. Maybe not as high as it was, but yes, initially people panicked and then they thought about it and said this could be good in some sense, but it doesn't blow the work that we're doing out of the water. It doesn't do that. On the regulation front, this is a huge challenge. And I'll go back to something that you said earlier, 10 days in, we've seen a lot of executive action. And yes, there was a directive by the White House back in October of 23 to incorporate AI in the government. And I think they saw that. If you go to that directive page now, it's 404 not found, it's not there. Executive action, there's a lot of it. The challenge with executive action is it doesn't go through the full process of legislative vetting. And because of that, you don't necessarily give opportunity to regulation to actually go through the proper channels. If you pull a trigger, you may be doing it for political reasons as opposed to governmental reasons. And that forces compliance in an industry where compliance isn't easy to do overnight. So you end up creating a lot of panic without transparency. And I think we want to try to avoid that. So it's a challenge for the government. How do we do this, balancing both the executive orders and trying to maintain a legislative process?
So I have a quick follow-up. I want to come back to you, Raj, in a second. You're still in government. How do you see the legislative process coming back in? I mean, are you guys getting support from the House and Senate, or what is the path forward here? Because the reason I'm asking those questions is not because I'm a policy junkie. The reason I'm asking is because businesses need some clarity. So Raj, I mean, if you're operating in this environment where executive orders are passed and the rules aren't laid out properly, of course you have your own internal challenges, but how does that affect, somebody like a CISO like you? If the federal policy is effectively just happening in a rather haphazard way?
And a lot of American corporations are also global in nature, right? So we have to worry about EU, you have their own AI Act, California has CCPA, CPRA, Massachusetts has their own, Virginia has their own, South Carolina has their own, right? Some of them may indirectly apply to AI regulation or data. It's about data, right? It's about data security and privacy, correct? So I think we obviously, our legal team does that analysis. They give us input as to what we can or cannot do, right? A lot of the time we will defer a lot of that liability into the provider of AI, like Microsoft or Amazon or Google, right? And they have, so there's a lot of deference, that we could do, but in some cases, if you're building your own models, then we will obviously look at what regulation is out there, right? So I think, can't give you a straight answer on that in the sense that as a technologist, what we do is, there's something called generative adversarial networks, GANs, right? Which is under the hood, this is how LLMs work. So what we do is, to your question about hallucinations can happen, right? And you can cajole a model to give you an incorrect response, right? So what we do is, in corporate America, we are trying to create models, so like you have a primary, you have an attacker and a defender, right? So we use a similar model to, like, before it gives, if you're doing something critical, right? And if life and death matters on a response from a model, we will verify it with another model. Before we will, so there's a verification step that we have added. Just like if you are like asking a model to give you answer some questions, and the response is going to contain PII or NPI, right? Then we have sanitization layers that we are trying to add into the mix, so that we can actually scrub that data, obfuscate that data, right? Redact that data before the response goes back to the user. Now we are not 100% successful all the time, right? So I think that's how we are trying to do that, is to actually try to get some validation, because data could be hallucinating, data could be poisoned, right? So I think those are some of the things that we are trying to do. This is, again, not a perfected technique. If you look at the number of startups that are coming out in that space, this is a problem that the industry wants to solve. It's okay, how do you actually have secure integrations, implementations, and interactions with AI, quote unquote, right? So there's a lot of work going on in that space. The large players obviously are looking into that capability. So that's what we are trying to do, right? Is to use GANs.
I do want to pick up on this life and death thing, and that's the right time to bring in Poorva here, who's from the life sciences. Poorva, we're talking outside before this session about how the FDA is one of those agencies that has been quite active on the regulatory side, and thankfully so for all of us, especially on the medical device side. So could you talk to us about your interactions with the FDA, or the areas that the FDA has oversight with medical devices, even perhaps drug discovery? What are you seeing as to number one, how Gen AI is being used, and what have you seen from a regulatory response standpoint to those developments?
So my interjection comes here in a very interesting discussion on data ethics and regulated AI on the human side. And I would like to start by saying that this humongous data that has come and being processed by different LLMs and analytics applied, the data that I interject with is so related to human health and medical doctors and researchers. So it becomes very important in the industry that I operate in that the regulations are at the forefront. Every device that comes, that is the reason FDA is so concerned about having the ethics and regulations in place early on before it has a damaging effect later on. But FDA is only one way, and it is a very sound way to protect and have those regulations. So the way they are doing is they're ensuring all the devices and any sort of, even if they have an AI component to it or not, have good barriers in place and regulations. But beyond FDA, I want to say that beyond FDA, there is a huge need of having those ethics in place. And there are 3 to 4 ways where these ethics and regulations come into place. First is the data privacy side, where we talk about the data privacy side as HIPAA, and data on the European side. The second is the clinical outcome, or where the data is in clinics and in the hospital settings. It's the patient data, the EHR, the electronic health records. And the third side is the research data. There's a big churn of data in different forms. It is medical data, it is the omics data, as in the, and there is analytics data. It is early research data being used by the big corporates, the big companies, AstraZeneca, Moderna. It is directly used for human health, for creating drugs, for creating devices for patients. And then there is this generalized data that is available by agencies for, again, having policies in place for the leaders to use it. And there is a lot of open source data, and what these bigger organizations like NIH, like HHAs, they are doing is they are having many different safeguards in place and having this data very open and transparent. But at the same time, when we talk about the device data that is coming through FDA, there are a couple of ways that I'm coming back to my question, giving a big picture of where the data and the LLMs are in place. So FDA has a certain way of regulating. So you have to submit FDA, go through a process through the FDA. There is a different process for the devices, different process for the drugs, and going through the data, getting it approved early on before manufacturing can begin is important. So I have not specifically worked on that side, specifically on devices. I've worked on getting approvals for certain drugs in the process. But yes, FDA does have a very tight tab, and I think it is absolutely important. But where slip-throughs are happening is where there is a lot of patient data, and there are so many apps and platforms being created. There's so many softwares, and innumerable ones. And it is important to have regulations in place early on, and also being very having ethical control on how the human data is used for like health equity. There are people coming from different cultures, and the data is segmented in so many demographics. Are we able to use all that data for the clinical trials, for creating clinical trials where the drugs are created safe and equal for all. So this is where AI comes in picture, and it is upon us to make sure that all kinds of data is being used and regulations are in place. This is real my perspective, a broader one than FDA.
No, thank you. That's just
I
great.
can have a comment on that, right?
Yeah, please.
So, like, what I also meant by life and death is like if you use a Gen AI system in disease, like for example prescriptions. So if you go and say, okay, what should be the prescription for these symptoms, and it gives you a response, and if the prescription is wrong because either it hallucinated or data was bad, right? It was poisoned. Then who has the liability for if there is something bad that happens from a model that you trust? Right? So I think that's the medical angle that we have to all worry about is, okay, how do we trust it to actually, if you give somebody a wrong prescription in a hospital, there may be a life and death matter there, right? And that's the liability you have to worry about.
I mean, I want to swing it back to Sanjay, but Sanjay, you've heard some really interesting and fascinating, things here across a wide range of issues. So my question for you is, obviously, number one, is anything that you've heard here surprise you? Number two, is there's one hypothesis that perhaps we should regulate sector by sector. Healthcare is different than some other sector and so on and so forth. Of course, there's cybersecurity is like a horizontal kind of technology that goes across the board. And the last thing I want to ask you, like in that same vein, is this notion of data, as Poorva mentioned. Do you think, given your experience in tech, and you've been part of the entire digital wave, you've seen data from bits and bytes to terabytes now, is there a need to look at data governance anew in this environment? So question number one is, do you think there should be a sectoral approach from a regulatory standpoint? And second, number two, what are your views on how corporations and entities, public or private, look at their current data management, data strategies?
Those are very good questions. I mean, I was just listening to some of these, interfaces. So when I talk to policymakers in the conversations we have, one of the things that comes at me is they say that we already have a lot of policies in place. When she talks about FDA has approved over 100 AI-related devices. There are rules already in place. FTC has rules in place. AI doesn't give you a pass on doing crazy things. Department of Labor has rules in place. Now, obviously, those things need to be tweaked. The one thing I can tell you, Rohit, is we are not, in this country, we will never get a comprehensive AI Act like the EU.
At the federal level.
At the federal level.
Yeah.
That's the conclusion in conversations after conversations I've had with people. They say, we let the EU tie its hands up, we are not going to do that. And this is coming from people who actually write policy in this country. And they said, we will do things incrementally. Now, obviously, with the changes that we have had, I'm even thinking that maybe there isn't going to be that kind of incremental change. We have, and Aastha would know it, we had a National Safety Institute under NIST. Right now the question is, what's going to happen to the National Safety Institute, which was funded, etc. So the thing is, obviously, there is going to be regulations. I have a feeling that it's going to be state. You will see the Californias, the Colorados and others who will drive a lot of these things. And I have a feeling standards will start coming into play, because when you see OECD, ISO is working on some things, etc., those things will start becoming more relevant also besides policy, because if there is a vacuum, something will fill the vacuum. Now, you asked about data. The one thing I would say is the topic that keeps coming to me when I talk to industry leaders, etc., is synthetic data.
Right.
And that, I think, is a potential where you can even look at whether it's from a bias standpoint, or even how do you factor in those kind of data, because more and more, I mean, if you look at what OpenAI has done in their latest version, a large volume of training has been, because if you talk to the big foundation companies, they say, we've run out of data. Because they have ingested, basically, that's what is publicly available. Now, obviously, they are going to find. So, where do they get? Now, obviously, there's other things. You know, the inferencing, the reasoning, and etc. So, I think data is going to have some very interesting issues, and we have some Supreme Court laws that are going to come in terms of what is fair use and things of that nature. So, I don't know if that kind of answers some of the things.
It does, and I think I'm glad you ended your comment on the legal, point, because it seems like if, let's say, we don't have a federal law and we have this patchwork of state by state and there's wide variation, it just creates any entity that's doing commerce across state lines, the jurisdiction, the laws that need to be applied. Raj talked about global operations. This seems like a nightmare because there's just no guidance there. At some point, you
well, lawyers are going to do pretty well.
Lawyers are going to do pretty well. Aastha, I want to come back to you because Poorva gave a pretty good rundown of what the FDA is doing, and again, I think Sanjay also kind of pointed out that the FDA is and there are a lot of agencies that are kind of ahead of the game in sense, or at least they know the vectors along which they want to look at. Should we take hope as taxpayers that if the FDA has gotten its act together on how to regulate AI, that other government agencies will do the same? They can learn from it?
Short answer is yes.
Oh, wow.
The long answer is sometimes it's hard
Okay.
to exchange information. I mentioned, I started my talk with that, right?
Right.
Exchanging information, data sharing between agencies is itself sometimes a challenge. Not so much when you're going civilian to civilian, but if you're crossing boundaries, as I mentioned, between intel community and civilian community, then it's a challenge. But I think anytime an agency comes up with a model that works even over a small scope, there's facets of it that can be used and reapplied elsewhere. So, I mean, it's hard to answer that question on behalf of my agency or the federal government, how that will work. I'm participating in my own level with all of that. What I can tell you is that agencies do have methods of exchanging information. We do have tech exchanges, we do have forums, and there are conferences in which we attend. Sometimes they're limited to government, those conferences. So there's a lot of active participation that's happening on many levels, on many topics. I think if the FDA comes out of the gate leading in this regard, then the other agencies will have at least a paradigm to look at and to consider when creating their own policies. Ultimately, there's no governing framework. And I think it's going to take a while to arrive at a governing framework. But even if we do, that framework has to be adaptable because this technology is happening and iterating so fast that framework should be solid enough to stand and not be obsolete in 6 months.
So I'm hoping that there's a political will to create that, and hopefully a bipartisan political will to create that.
I think that's the key. We do need to figure out how to get some of these legislative processes back into the mix, because I think that's what strengthens the law and allows it to be vetted fully. And then you hopefully don't have as many challenges navigating between boundaries, whether it is between agencies or between states. If they're all going to do their own thing, it just makes the problem harder, not easier.
I mean, this panel, I could have a whole day conference just with these guys, but I want to end the session by asking the same question to all the panelists. And that question is there a regulation that you wish we had? Is there a specific area that you feel needs to be regulated that is not either being sufficiently regulated or should be regulated? So I'll start with you, Raj.
I think what we should do is we should not obviously become draconian with regulations, right? So my recommendation would be to set the ground and not the ceiling. You set the ground with a privacy type of a regulation to give be that vector that provides direction, and then like individual states can go above and beyond, or agencies can go above and beyond. Don't set it so high like GDPR is, right? And GDPR that's not been very successful. So I feel that that's a privacy regulation that sets the ground level, and then and then you can build upon it incrementally rather than shooting for the moon and obviously not getting there.
I would say compliance is going to be a big challenge. Because I can tell you, even in the world of cybersecurity, we issue binding operational directives that apply to the federal civilian executive branches, but it only goes that far. It doesn't apply to DoD. So conducting assessments, figuring out what their posture is from a risk perspective, even those challenges are hard. So trying to figure out how to get companies, private sector, to comply to any kind of a regulation is going to be a challenge. So I'll put that out there. I don't have an answer necessarily to your question. I think I have another question to pose to your question, is how do we create a compliance framework that is going to make it easier for businesses to do their business and not get hung up trying to figure out what regulation means.
You're assuming that there might be regulations now.
I'm assuming at least that there's going to be some kind of a framework that we have to establish against which some compliance measures need to be there. Otherwise, how do you put your gold stamp on anything?
Right. I love Raj's idea of having at least, let's just start off with the floor here, and then we can go.
Yeah. And
Poorva.
I really like the idea of what Aastha put out, the frameworks, and it's important. Like I've seen WHO put out some global health frameworks, and definitely there needs to be a committee to revise them from time to time. That frame will is shorter. It's not a year or 5 year long. It's not a quarter. It's shorter. But for me, I would not be able to answer any particular way to have the AI being implemented. But I would definitely say, if AI is being implemented, it should be focused on the outcome for human health. That is primary, not patient or anyone, but just human health as a broader area. If the impact is positive for human health, then whatever rules and regulations are put up are great. If not, does not make sense. Thank you.
All right, Sanjay.
So I think our history of our country is that we do regulation when something really bad happens. And I have a feeling something like that would happen. I have a lot of different topics, but if I were to pick one, I would say deepfakes is definitely something that should, because it has implications for young women, it has implications for political campaigns, our democracy and everything else. And there is, watermarking is there, but there is not really a great way to kind of figure out from a technology standpoint yet, because they stay one step ahead. But I would say, if I were to pick one, I would say that would be the one.
That's a big one. AI washing is a big issue. And it's not just, yes, as a woman I can definitely agree with what you said, that the entertainment industry, you've seen Hollywood create a major fuss over this, right? Because you can use anyone's voice to advertise a product, or to, as you said, create a deep fake. And I think they're rightly concerned.
Then say your daughter is being kidnapped and stuff like that. So I mean, there's a litany of stuff, but it kind of in that category.
Even for cyber, right? Like for example, you must have read that there was a $20 million fraud that occurred in Europe where somebody used a deep fake and had to generate the voice for pretending to be the CEO of some company, and actually the employee wired a large chunk of money. So deepfake has become so scary, and obviously it's leading to a lot of fraud. So definitely that's an area that I would support.
Well, I was going to end it here, but I have a question for Raj. So Raj, I told somebody that you'll be on the panel, you're a CISO, and the thought experiment that me and my friend wanted to do was to make you the CISO of Netflix, and see how do you comply with things like copyright law? How do you make sure that the information that's passing through your systems is sanitized from an intellectual property standpoint? Digital rights management, yep.
Yeah, so I think that DRM technology is there, and it needs to improve, right, with the proliferation with AI generated problems, right? So yes, definitely DRM is the solution, so that intellectual property liability right? And then the problem is that, that also varies again by country, right? The law that may be in Europe may be slightly different than in some other country, right? So I think that's why it's a tough problem to solve, definitely. But I feel that, with maturing digital rights management capabilities, rights management, and in corporate world, we try to do that. Like, for example, Microsoft has solutions that we are actually categorizing our data, right? And similarly, you can categorize the data, you can figure out, you can label it. But again, there are still, obviously not a panacea, there are still problems with that.
Well, I want to thank my panel. It's been a wonderful, wide-ranging discussion, and thanks for the audience to engage. So please a big round of applause for these.